Welcome once again, everyone, to tonight's IHR Transport and Mobility History seminar. We're glad that you could come along and join us. Before we get started on tonight's proceedings, we're going to look ahead to the next session, which will be on the 5th of May, and Ian Kitts will be talking to us about British Transport Commission films. The booking is not yet open, but it will be going up on the IHR website before too long. So make a note of the date, 5th of May, and keep an eye out for the booking in due course. However, today, before we get into today, well, actually, no, partly to do with today, one of our co-conveners, David Turner, is not here because it is his birthday, and he's been granted a free pass on condition that he does watch the video after. So, happy birthday to David in his absence. But on to the main proceedings for tonight, and that is Alicia's paper. It's really great to introduce you to Alicia Barnes, who is a PhD student at the University of Surrey. Alicia, I'm sorry, I meant to check what year you're in, do that terrible thing, and I forgot to do
final
that.
Year. I
had a feeling it might be. So final year PhD student, which is, you know, sorry, no pressure from our part there. But also, I'm pleased to find out an award-winning PhD student, having won the Postgraduate Researcher of the Year within her faculty, Arts and Social Sciences, last year. So congratulations on that. That's great. I think we're going to see evidence of why that was in tonight's paper. Alicia's thesis is looking at a range of things, but intersections between imperialism, nationalism, and British railways in 19th century literature. Again, very much informing tonight's paper. She's interested in many broader things than that, as in national myths and histories, the Gothic, transport and mobility history, print cultures, amongst others. And I am also looking forward to reading the article that's coming out shortly in Victorian Periodicals Review, Readership and Railway Accidents, John Harapath's Railway magazine. So that one's right up my street. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing that in print. Tonight, Alicia is actually, I should have said, joining us from America, where she's at a conference. So she's really jamming in the academic credentials, giving a paper at the conference as well as a paper tonight for us. But she'll be speaking to the title, The Indian Eye on Railway Life, Modernity, Empire and Mobility. Alicia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. And thank you everyone for coming to hear my paper today. I'll just share my screen and then we can get going. Great, can everyone see that okay? Yeah, wonderful. Great, so yes, my paper today, The Indian Eye on Railway Life, Modernity, Empire and Mobility. Just to give a bit of an overview of how today's going to work, I'd like to have a bit of a disclaimer at the beginning here, talking about who's I, where I sit as a researcher within this project, where this project sits within my wider research. This does come from a chapter in my thesis, kind of take you through a brief history of empire and the railways, who the travel writers are that I'm looking at today, and how they're experiencing the railways in Britain, which is really what I'm interested in these travel narratives. So first of all, a bit of a disclaimer. You know, this is not my I am not Indian. I'm not from South Asia. I'm very much coming to these travel narratives from a very academic standpoint. You know, I can never have the kind of experiences that these writers are writing about. And certainly from a couple of months ago, from Dr. Ollie Betts's talk on blind railway passengers in the early 20th century, and before then as well, I've really been thinking about how I fit within this research. You know, what kind of reminiscences I'm bringing to this as a scholar in Britain, as a white scholar in Britain. How I can increase my collaboration with this project, and I'll speak a bit more about that later. Certainly in terms of the access I've had to these texts. But yes, I'm very aware and open to suggestions about how I can make this research more actively decolonial is what I'm aiming for. You know, I don't want to be kind of replicating the same kind of imperial structures that these travel narratives were written within and are speaking to. But I'm also very aware that I am, you know, a Western scholar based in London. So part of them, obviously, the my attempts at diversifying this research, but also very much how I kind of came to it. I'd like to make mention of the incredible scholars that have already talked about South Asian travel narratives, South Asian subjects traveling to Britain, their experiences of the empire, both in India and in Britain as well. And so just a few of them, we have Marion Aguiar's Tracking Modernity, which is a really excellent study on the construction of colonial space in India with the railways. Indep Agrawal's Home and Harem, Nation, Gender, Empire, and the Cultures of Travel. Michael Fisher, Shompa Lahiri, and Shinda S. Tandi's A South Asian History of Britain. Pramod K. Nayar's Colonial Subject and Aesthetic Understanding, Indian Travel Literature About England. Mary Louise Pratt's Imperial Eyes, which is a really, really foundational text thinking about, that kind of perception, that gaze. Again, I'm going to speak to a bit more later. Simonti Sen's Travels to Europe, Self and Other in Bengali Travel Narratives. Sarah Soleri, The Rhetoric of English India. Rosina Visram, Asians in Britain, 400 Years of History, and also her Ayaz, Lascars and Princes, The Story of Indians in Britain. So really I am so indebted to these scholars and the work that they've done before me. So a big acknowledgement to them. And I would recommend you can all go away and read their work. It's absolutely fascinating. So yes, the title of my talk comes from, so Whose Eye? It comes from the Ranji Malabari's The Indian Eye on English Life, or Rambles of a Pilgrim Reformer. This is one of the main travel narratives that I'll be speaking about today. And really what kind of strikes me, why I wanted to use it, is this reference to the gaze, this kind of reclaiming of what's known as the imperial gaze. And it's not just Malabari's title that does this. Actually, many other references to this gaze are taken by many of the other travel narratives included as well. And by this gaze, I'm thinking about the gaze of Western European travel narratives being a part of the production of empire, as European travelers going out to kind of survey, catalogue, judge, and assess for colonization. So that becoming part of that imperial gaze. This gaze, constructed racial hierarchies and determined power and access to that power. So here, why I wanted to focus on this eye is recognizing that these writers are very, very aware of the power of perception and the power of reclaiming that perception, and in part reversing it. So now I'm not suggesting that they are able to completely reverse this gaze, because the power structures of empire, of the British Raj, that they were living under does make that impossible. But they are reversing partially, and these reversals will come up in the parts of the text that I reference and produce some really, really interesting writings. So yes, just a couple of other titles that refer to this gaze. You have London Sketched by an Indian Pen, Impressions of Persons and Things, Reminiscences, England to an Indian Eye, or English Pictures from an Indian Camera, and London and Paris through Indian Spectacles. So there is very much this kind of recognition that they're owning that they are Indian travelers. They are here to witness, to perceive, to recognize, and in part understand what they're seeing in England, in London, in Britain. And so as well, considering my access to these texts, these are all published in English. I do not speak or read Urdu or Hindi. I can only read them in English. None of them, one of them I found was published in translation, although I don't make much reference to that one here. They're also, most of them are digitized. They are very, very easily accessible. A couple are at the British Library, but the majority of them are freely available on Google Books. So although I'm aware that there's probably many more published throughout India, and I think that they would really enrich some of this research and some of this understanding of the perception of imperial culture in Britain, as seen and experienced by these Indian travelers. I don't have access to them. Hence, I think collaboration would really enrich that part of this research as well. So, briefly talking through my thesis, as I said to Mike, I'm in my final year of my thesis at Surrey, so kind of in the writing up stages now, which is an interesting feeling. Yeah, time is moving quickly. Yeah, so my thesis, provisionally titled "The Iron Arm of Empire: Railways and Imperialism in 19th Century Literature," is really looking at the ways in which the British Empire, both the idea of it and the reality of it as a network, as a physical political thing, kind of unsettled a kind of national self-perception of the British as British, as an island nation, as the Little England, and that's specifically through the symbol of the railway in literature. So I'm thinking of the railway as simultaneously, yes, this very kind of nationalist symbol for Britain, the kind of marker of British superiority of technological engineering, making Britain really kind of singular in both Europe and the world, but also as a very real marker of that of imperial networks, of imperial exploitation, expansion, and development. And so throughout the thesis, I'm thinking about the kind of mobility that railways prompted and produced, and how they necessarily prompted a kind of importation of empire directly into Britain, into the nation. And yes, and as it says in the slides, you know, I work through lots of different forms of writing: journalism, poetry, short stories, novels, and travel writing, which is where this research comes from. So this research is the central chapter of the thesis. It's chapter 3, which looks at texts from across the 19th century, travel texts published across the 19th century, but most are from the final 2 decades. So although the rest of the thesis does kind of work chronologically, starting with journalism in the 1830s all the way to kind of fin de siècle Gothic fiction at the end of the century, this chapter kind of marks a bit of a turning point, both in terms of the chronology and as well the kind of major themes. So moving from more explicitly nationalist impulses towards a more fluid idea of imperial mobility. So yes, my first 2 chapters focus on setting up that national image of the railway in early literature. So that's looking at John Hercott's Railway Magazine and Basil Montague's Railroad Eclogues. And then we have this central chapter kind of taking those national myths that are created in that literature, and then kind of turning them kind of both outward and inward, as we have kind of the adoption of those national myths by these Indian travelers coming back to England and kind of projecting them onto England and London as well. And then the final 2 chapters looking outward towards the threats that the railway could bring into Britain. So I look at George Chesney's The Battle of Dorking and Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now, thinking about the kind of martial, economic and cultural threat of other European imperial powers. And the final chapter looks at fin de siècle anxieties of imperial collapse and racial decline. So yes, this chapter really works to kind of centralize the imperial elements of the thesis, and also demonstrate the wide-ranging effects that this British construction and conception of the railway had. So it wasn't just the understanding that the railway as technology superior and marker of Great Britain kind of stroked British egos, but also that it was that was transported throughout the empire and really worked to affect an imperial hierarchy of Britain's own making, kind of anywhere you had railways. So on that note, a brief kind of overview of my understanding of the railways and civilization and modernity. So from the very, very beginning, the railway was envisioned as a great civilizing machine, really the emblem of modern colonization. So this movement from kind of older mercantile colonies towards industrial, capitalist, modern colonies. So Samuel Smiles, biographer of George Stephenson on the slide, he regarded that the railway was regarded as the pioneer of colonization, he writes. H.H. Johnson, who was a British colonial official in Africa, obviously a lot later in the century, said, again on the slide, there is no civilizer like the railway. So I really am thinking of the railway was always considered, and this is something that my thesis really kind of works to emphasize, that it was always considered with empire in mind. So really from the start, with the Liverpool and Manchester, developed to aid with imperial capitalist work, so transporting raw materials exploited from the colonies, from the port at Liverpool to the manufactories of Manchester, to then be returned to Liverpool for exportation and trade throughout the colonies once more. But also because of its ability to traverse vast stretches of land and difficult terrain, it was seen to be able to open up hinterlands and inlands. And so here we're thinking of Canada, the north and west frontiers, parts of Australia, and I'd like to make mention to another transport mobility history seminar we had, I think it was back in 2019, in person on the Australian colonial railroads as well. And Africa later in the century, of course, and of course in India. So prior to railway construction, really, colonies were limited. They were restricted to developing around ports, and they couldn't reach as far inland as they could with the help of railway construction and transport. Because of its ability to colonize, it was then also seen as a great civilizer, so being able to bring Western capitalist ideas to the colonies, and this is in the form of trade, certain types of mobility, and to partly industrialize those communities, although this of course was not done fully. This idea of civilization then was also kind of turned inside. It also turned in towards the British nation as well. And a national network was thought to be able to civilize the lower classes through kind of uniform state education, democratized travel, although of course this was always more ideological than real, and also to aid with policing efforts. And that's something that you kind of see mirrored both in Britain, certainly with the Chartist uprisings of the 1840s, and then later with the Indian uprising, 1857. So then moving on towards Indian railways, although the first railway in India wasn't opened until 1853 between Bombay and Thane, railway construction in India was attempted as early as the mid-1830s. And so in John Herapath's Railway magazine, the very first railway periodical that started in 1835, in the second issue, he writes an article titled "Railways in India." He writes that they were thought of as an alternative to canals. Herapath describes how railway construction would be a good substitute, especially because it would be cheaper to build in India, because companies would not have to pay the large sums for the land they do in England. So I think the fact that Herapath, who's writing this railway magazine in the second issue, references railway construction in India, demonstrates the interest that the railway community had in colonies, in railway construction as a part of that colonial regime, as a part of imperial capitalist trade. And also one of Herapath's main gripes in the early days of railway construction is the obscene amount of money that poor railway companies have to pay landowners for their land. But obviously in India, that's not a problem, because railway companies we can just take it and it's fine. Don't need to pay the large sums of money that we do in England. So let's build railways in India. They were explicitly seen as political, and this is both by the communities in India and by communities in Britain. So again, this is from the Railway magazine. This is from an anonymous article called "The Progress of Steam in India." It says, "The establishment of railroads in India is perhaps quite as much a political as a mercantile question. The possession of such sure and rapid means of communication would give the government a firmer hold of this country than ever the Romans possessed of their empire through the imperial roads which they constructed throughout the length and breadth of it." It is very clearly all to do with empire. You know, they even refer to the Roman Empire and this kind of myth that the British Empire is even greater and will last even longer than the Roman Empire because of these railroads, because they are the permanent way. They will give the British a sure foothold in the country, in India, that they can never lose. They are the permanent way. So yes, there's no doubt that the railway was connected to empire from the very beginning, connected to the civilizing mission, to colonization, to ideas of power and subjection. So yes, thinking again about these ideas of power and who, I suppose, who the railways were built for. Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire details exactly why the railways the British built in India were not the gift empire apologists thought they were. Built for imperial benefit, not for the people of India, and built at a cost to the taxpayer. So I'm quoting from Tharoor here. In terms of a secure return, Indian railway shares offered twice as much as the British government's own stock. Guaranteed Indian railway shares absorbed up to a fifth British portfolio investment in the 20 years to 1870. The first line opened in 1853, but only 1% of it originated in India. Britons made the money, controlled the technology, and supplied all the equipment, which Indian people, which meant once again that the profits were repatriated. All the losses were borne by the Indian people, all the gains pocketed by the British trader. So yes, again, we have a clear, even in the construction of the railways in India, you know, there is no, it's not for the benefit of the Indian nation, the Indian people. It is as a colonial tool. And after the rebellion of 1857 and the transfer of power from the East India Company to the British Crown, the establishment of the Raj, there was a push for further railway building to aid with policing efforts. Faster transportation throughout the continent would mean easier access to quash any further rebellions. And as I said before, you kind of have that mirrored in a way with the idea of quashing those Chartist rebellions in the 1840s. This idea that, you know, being able to mobilize troops, being able to kind of stately organize and suppress any uprisings, really aided by the railway. So it's a very brief overview of how the railway was connected to those imperial ideologies and the very real structures and enactments of imperialism in India. So a bit of a spotlight on the travel writers. I won't read them all out. This is just a selection of them. This isn't all of the travel writers that I found, but these are the ones who do explicitly talk about their experiences with the railway, which I think is, you know, the part that I'm primarily interested in. And most of them as well these are all available on online if you're interested to read them, except for Amrita Roy, which is at the British Library, and Jinder Rams as well, also available at the British Library. Yes, so you can see there are you know, even just this selection, there aren't, you know, one or two, there are a lot. There were a lot of people traveling to Britain and a lot of people writing about it as well. Something else that really kind of signals the extent to which there was an Indian population in Britain are these lists of Indian students in Britain in the Journal of the National Indian Association, which is also known as the Indian Magazine. So this is a journal published in London, a British-based society really for other Indians to see their community in Britain. And these people, and there are people, you know, all over the UK. Although the majority are in London, as you can see, we do have people in Oxford, in Cambridge, in Edinburgh, and Glasgow, and Manchester. You know, there is, you know, pages and pages of names of people, and this is just one issue. This is just one issue, you know, 1 year there is a significant population of Indian people in Britain in the 19th century. So the writers that we know most about, just a brief overview of them. So Behramji and Malabari, again, the namesake of this paper, The Indian Eye on English Life, probably one of the most well-known travel logs that we've got today. His work as well, I think is so, it's really, really fantastic because it contains some really excellent and explicit as well as implicit moments of satire and criticism. The travel logs, as we'll kind of come to, do contain some really fascinating, some really unsettling moments of a kind of complex imperial subjectivity, where you can see both a kind of internalized hierarchy in the travel writers, but also moments of rebellion and radicalism and a kind of push against some kind of imperial ideas. And Malabari is a really great example of one of those. There are some really, really funny moments that he records, especially in the railway, that we'll come to a bit later. We also have T.N. Mukherjee. So he was actually employed by the British government to come over to Britain and curate some of the exhibits at the Colonial and Indian Exhibition in 1886. So he spends a lot of his time talking about his time at the exhibition, talking about the people that he sees there, what kind of things he learns about the British there, but also recognizing that yes, he was part of some of the structures of imperialism of the Raj. Also, Mehdi Hasan Khan, a Hyderabadi civil servant, so again, employed by the British government in India. He was not a total radical. These are people coming to Britain from a very, very privileged background, and as well, Reverend Thomas B. Pandian. Now he was actually a converted Christian. He became a reverend. So he's got some really interesting insights into British culture from an Indian Christian perspective. And again, you can see in his titles as well that kind of, again, that reference to the gays. So although he has become Christian, he's still very much owning his Indian nationality. That he's got both an Indian eye and an Indian camera, watching and taking pictures, being aware of the English and England. So overall, kind of what we know, some of them were civil servants, most of them were British educated. They really kind of gained an advantage with this British education. They were kind of allowed early access into kind of Western imperial culture. Most upper caste Hindus, we do have one Muslim traveler, and actually what's interesting about this, I don't really go into to religion in these papers, but certainly from what I've researched, Muslims were really some of the first South Asians to travel to England because of the taboo Hindu culture placed on overseas travels. And if anyone's interested in further research on South Asian travel writing, you've got Humayun Ansari's The Infidel Within, Tabesh Kher, Martin Lear, and Justin D. Edwards and Hannah Ziadeh's Other Roots, 1500 Years of African and Asian Travel Writing as well. So again, there is research on this, and it's really, really wonderful stuff. They were wealthy enough to travel. As we've seen, there were many students in England as well, but there were also people who didn't have the privilege of being named, or people who could write about their experiences there. So you had servants, indentured laborers and enslaved people, ayahs, laborers, lascars, and we don't have their voices recorded. And I think that as well needs to be considered as we approach these texts. These were very, very privileged men, and they were. I have found one woman writer, although that one was in translation, and I don't make reference to it here. But on the whole, these are male writers, and they don't they don't speak for the entirety of the nation. This is kind of pre-mainstream 20th century nationalist movements from India. And although there is kind of, certainly in the later part of the 19th century, a burgeoning idea of what it is to be an Indian national, they're not speaking for the entirety of the Indian nation. They are very much talking about their own personal perceptions of English culture and the English people. So yes, so as observers of the English, we need to understand that they were largely Anglophiles. They were Indian travelers who had lived comfortably under the Raj and had been saturated with British culture before their visits. And so that their comments upon English culture should really be read within this specific context. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, this does mean that they have a really complex imperial subjectivity. Excuse me. They do really have quite internalized hierarchies at some points. And then travel writing as well. Oh, excuse me. So the fact that they're also travel writing is a really, really interesting moment of kind of partial reversal as well. So travel writing, certainly Western European travel writing, was itself a part of the construction and imagination of empire. These travelers then are kind of reversing both the act of travel writing in the area of exploration. So they're not moving from the kind of imperial metropole out to the peripheries of empire, but instead they're kind of moving from what was seen as kind of the outward spaces back kind of into the middle. They're setting London as that place of exotic wonder and sometimes barbarity instead of the imperial peripheries. And this was a really popular genre by the end of the century. Oh, please excuse me. This was a really popular genre by the end of the century, and in some ways acted as a guide to other Indian readers. Some of them prefaced their works by saying that they wanted to kind of encourage friendship and good feeling between the two countries, between both their Indian readers and their British readers as well. And they also talk about how reform could be enacted through these travels. So both as an act of education, and as we see, we have many students traveling to England, but also as thinking about how reform could be made in both countries. So both changes to be made in India based on what they see in Britain, but as well, kind of they do pinpoint parts of British culture and British hegemony that they see as really quite hypocritical. So, for example, one thing that a lot of the travel writers pinpoint is the poverty that they see in London, and they say things like, as poor as India is, we don't see anything as bad as the poverty that we see in London, and that's really where there's that kind of disparity between the supposedly civilized center of empire being far worse for poor people than the supposedly backwards areas of the empire. And what's really, again, really interesting about this travel writing as well is that it provides clear evidence that kind of empire and imperial mobilities were not one way. We have people enacting this travel writing in the imperial epicenter itself. It was a matrix of mobilities and networks and connections that certainly wasn't ever actually realized as just a movement out from the center. So sorry for that whistle stop tour and my voice going a bit there. I'm now going to take you through some of kind of the key observations made by the Indian travelers of their experiences with the railway. So kind of bearing in mind that feels like ages ago now, that overview of the history of the railways, the kind of ideological conceptions of the railway as a civilizer, as a kind of mark of civilization. So these really range, their experiences, they range from kind of early amazement and reflections that of that supposed cultural superiority the railway embodies, to criticism of railway modernity, and how that supposed civilization actually crumbles under the weight of modernity. So early encounters. The earliest travel narrative that I have here is Jehangir Naroji and Hyojiboi Mwanji's Journal of a Residence of 2.5 years in Great Britain from 1841. These were cousins. They were part of a family that had served the East India Company since at least 1735, and they start their travel narrative by talking about their family history and their connections with the East India Company, and how they were master builders for the company's dockyard in Bombay. So they preface their travel with their reasons for traveling, which was to learn about specifically steam engineering for the construction of steamships in that dockyard. So they're going with already with this desire to learn very specifically about, yes, steam engineering, and so they're already very interested in that kind of form of industry. They're already interested in that type of technology. So now they've never traveled on a railway before. Railways hadn't been constructed in India at this point. And at this time, I believe there are only about 1,500 miles of track constructed. So we have at this point, we have the Liverpool and Manchester, the London and Birmingham and the Great Western Railway, and perhaps a handful of other early branch lines as well. So on the slide, I've put their very first sight and experience of the railway. And I'll just read out some of the key parts for you. And if we had been astonished at the several description of carriages that we had seen, how shall we describe our very great astonishment at what we saw on the railroad? It was called the Great Western, and it leaves London at Paddington, opening away to the western coast of England, and is intended to run to Bath, Bristol, Gloucester, and Cheltenham. We travelled to a place called Slough, 25 miles in 50 minutes. Only think, within an hour, seated quietly in a beautiful carriage, we were 25 miles from London. We did not feel that we were passing so rapidly through the country when we looked at distant objects, but when we looked upon anything near to us, we but saw it and it vanished. And when the other train of carriages passed us, it was almost as if a flash of lightning had gone by. We could not distinguish any one of the carriages. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things, like key ideas that this very first perception of the railway sparks. We have this kind of wonder, this excitement, this kind of magic and majesty of the railway, these ideas of modernity. We have ideas of empire, of opening up the way, to the hinterland that is the western coast of England. There's these wild spaces that we're running to Bath and Bristol and Gloucester and Cheltenham. And of course, these ideas of like panoramic images, the kind of new experiences of perception that so many people have written about, that the railway carriage and railway traveling afforded passengers. So after this kind of initial encounter, they go on, they reproduce 10 pages worth of explanation of what the railway is, how it works, what it can be used for, and how the British are really enjoying its developments. And speed is absolutely key. They say, no country, therefore, can be considered to possess so much talent and means calculated to increase and extend commerce and the physical comforts of its inhabitants as Great Britain. Surely it is a great country, nay, the greatest on earth and the present period. Now, this quotation here, it speaks to that kind of quite unsettling internalization of those hierarchies that I mentioned before. They see the railway as the reason for Britain's greatness, for its supremacy in trade and commerce, and for its being the greatest country on earth. Now, this is, really, these are really grand claims, and they make it very, very clear that it's the railway that allows Britain to be that supposedly best place, best country in the world. So with that in mind, obviously that's very early in railway development. most of the other travel narratives are from later in the century, when the British network is really quite extensive and starting to form a sort of complete network. And England really does become railway land. N.L. Doss says England is preeminently a country of railways. Railroads cover the country with a close network. The main lines, like so many veins, diverge in different directions from London, the heart of the country, while branch lines connect them with all the important towns. The railways have been assimilated. They've been adopted into the body, into the very functioning and vital processes that the country needs. They are the lifeblood of the nation. So yes, we do see that the kind of admiration for the technological developments Britain has acquired, which continues throughout the century. We also see the same kind of myths that do accompany early ideas of the railway. So kind of thinking about the railways as that kind of quaint, lovely countryside emblem of Britain. And these are kind of used to mark a separateness between Britain's railways and India's railways. So Pillai's London and Paris Through Indian Spectacles. This is a particularly poetic travelogue. Pillai was a poet, and so he the scenes that he produces are really quite singular compared to the other travel narratives. They are very, very beautiful and poeticized perceptions of what's going on in Britain. So this is him writing about kind of waking up in a strange land. The sound of horses' hooves, the rattling noise of carriages, the perpetual roar of railway trains. Surely you are in a strange land. And now this really does kind of continue throughout the travelogues, this idea of differentiating between railways in England from railways in India. And part of that is this idea of modernity. So again, this kind of imperial conception that India was backwards and stuck in the past and kind of stagnating, finds expression in this idea that London in particular is the marker of modernity in its ability to move and be mobile and be busy and all the things that come along with that. So I find that here. So what strikes an Asiatic most on getting out of Victoria Station, Malabari writes, is the noise and bustle around him. This is foreign. This kind of idea of modernity, this busyness is apparently not understood, not seen in India at this time. London is the city of business. Everyone appears busy. The pedestrians walk fast as if racing with time itself. Time is very valuable here. Those who want to go still faster take the Underground Railway, where trains run every minute or so. So the difference between what is seen as busy modernity in England, facilitated by the railways in terms of the commodification of time through faster travelling speeds, filtering masses of passengers through specific points on the network, so we think of stations, and really the complex organisation systems required to enable the flow of those people, and the apparent stagnation, as I said, in India, which was a really well-worn imperial rhetoric used to express the backwardness of India and their state supposedly in a stage of earlier civilization. We see apparently their inability to adequately develop the natural resources of the land, kind of legitimizing colonial exploitation. And so again, it is really interesting to see the ways in which this has been internalized by the travel writers and then reproduced as they are witnessing the railway spaces in England. T.B. Pandian, so he says, alighting on one of the many platforms of the Victoria Station, London, the Oriental stranger is bewildered by the number of such landings that he views about him, his unaccustomed eyes being familiar with no more than 3 on Indian lines. T.N. Mukherjee writes, engines puffing and whistling, passengers running in and out, guards shutting doors, the faint hum of voices, all combine to create a grandeur of busy life, which must be seen to be fully realized. So again, this is all incredibly foreign. This is all kind of used to to mark that difference between railway construction in England, which was constructed for a very, very different purpose to the construction in India. You know, if railway construction in India had the same motives as in England, perhaps, you know, actually fully industrializing rather than prohibiting development in India under the British Raj, we may have had a different situation. We also find that the railways is the place to observe British people. Go to any railway station, you will find it thronged with passengers, some going into, others coming out. You will always see railway officials engaged in issuing, purchasing and collecting tickets, puffing and whistling of engines, passengers stepping in and out of railway carriages, railway guards shouting out the names of stations and shutting doors make a lasting impression on one's mind of the busy life of London. Now, Malabari, as I said at the beginning, he offers some of the most astute criticism of British and English modernity and railway culture. And this is kind of just the part of the start of what he then kind of goes on to say, which will be on the next slide. So, to have an adequate idea of what a crowd in London means, one might repair to a railway station. The crush is indescribable. To say that it is tremendous is to give but a feeble description of it. I wonder how people can stand the noise and bustle. If I were to be detained in such a crowd for a few hours, I'm afraid I would either be stunned or distracted beyond cure. He makes it very clear that he feels that the British railway travelling public are kind of sacrificing some parts of civilization in order to experience this railway modernity. They're giving up the you know, kind of socially distanced space. You know, they're purposefully ramming themselves into these spaces to be a part of what he sees as British industrial modernity, which is by no means a good thing in Malabari's eyes. And this is a really funny passage. It is amusing to see men and women rushing frantically to the railway station in the nick of time, hugging their packages under their arm and flourishing their umbrellas at the guard or the conductor. Here comes a matron, puffing and panting, just as the engine whistles departure. She runs from gate to gate, anxious to give chase if the gatekeeper will let her in. She is in quite a fluster and as red in the face as her national roast beef. Now, why could she not have come in a minute earlier? But that is just what she cannot or will not do. In such a mad rush for life, people can hardly talk in words. They have to use brief, sometimes inarticulate sounds instead. It is seldom that you hear a complete sentence. People in the streets have no time for dignity of language or of behaviour. He then goes on to write, I must not forget to add that all this hurry-scurry of the station subsides in a moment as soon as the gate opens to let passengers in, after getting their tickets punched. The crowd then tries to be solemnly decorous, and as you pick your way forward, you feel as if attending your own funeral. Now, just a couple of bits that I want to kind of highlight in this passage. I think it's really funny and some really excellent observations made by Malabari here. He finds this kind of desperate need to rush that he encapsulates in this matron as ridiculous. You know, he hasn't provided an instance of perhaps a businessman that's rushing to an important meeting. That he emphasizes the ridiculous nature of this busy modernity by suggesting that all people, even people who perhaps don't have anywhere that they should be rushing to, have got themselves into a rush for no real reason. There's no adequate reason to be doing this, to be putting yourself through this and to make yourself look so ridiculous. The puffing and panting as well that he talks about with the matron is doing is strikingly reminiscent of the puffing of the steam locomotives that other travel writers have previously said. So, you know, it's very much encapsulated within the railway space. It's all about railway mobility, railway speed, railway modernity that has produced this ridiculous nature. He talks about how this kind of mad rush for life as well has had a degenerative effect on British people. And in fact, they've kind of descended into almost barbarity. You know, they use brief, inarticulate sounds. You know, you don't hear a complete sentence. They have no time for dignity of language or behavior. They've really kind of regressed in whatever their ideas of civilization are. And then in the second paragraph here, he, in a really interesting reversal of the kind of extinction discourse that was prevalent in racial sciences at the end of the 19th century as well, he talks about how the fact that, you know, if life has sped up so much in this idea of modernity, that you're actually rushing towards death far more quickly than you would be were you not within this realm of modernity. You know, you feel as if you're attending your own funeral as you step on to the platform to get onto the railway. Now, yes, as I said, so this extinction discourse in racial sciences really kind of conflated ideas of social Darwinism and eugenics, and said that backwards races and cultures would necessarily go extinct if they could not adapt to the modern world. Well, here Malabari is kind of turning that on its head and is saying, no, it's the modern world that is producing early death. You're rushing, if you rush through life like this, you're rushing towards your own death. So some really interesting comments made by Malabari there. And here's quite a nice image of people rushing onto a train. And it does, you know, this does really encapsulate that kind of this lack of dignity that Malabari clearly sees, that this is not the simple place of civilization that it's so thought to be. Now, part of this modernity is, of course, modern capitalism, a huge part of the modern phase of imperialism as well. Advertisements are frequently noted in travelogues, with some really complaining of the confusion that they cause and the apparent desire for the British to push advertisements rather than kind of useful, functional knowledge. So Mukherjee writes, the stations are full of advertisements. There is hardly an inch of wall not occupied by one kind or another, so that at first we were at a loss to know whether the name of the station was Pear's Soap or Coleman's Mustards. Carriages are also full of them. There's clear disdain, again, at this kind of ridiculousness that you're sacrificing a kind of easily navigable, you know, functional knowledge to help you navigate this very complex system of this very complex network in favor of modern capitalism. You know, you instead of knowing where you need to go, you need to know whether you're going to buy a Pear's Soap or Coleman's Mustard. Just some more interesting comments made by the travel writers. We also get this sense that they're very aware of the ways in which the railways have affected people's working lives, people commuting to and from work, and the precious leisure time that they now have. So we see in NL Das writes, the work of the day was over and people were now hurrying home. All were rushing for the trains, several of which, intended for the various parts of the city and its suburbs, were standing near their respective platforms. At the interval of every 2 or 3 minutes, a train was starting off while another came in to take its place. Now, Doss here, he explicitly says the trains are coming very, very regularly, every 2 or 3 minutes, but people can apparently not wait those 2 or 3 minutes to get whichever train comes in to take its place, because their leisure time has been so commodified, as with all other time. You know, they're really hurrying home. This is precious. They're not able to enjoy time anymore, that Doss and others kind of see as being part of that kind of pre-railway modern time. So another part of travel narratives that you kind of see, that you see reversed in these travelogues, the kind of what Western travelogues were doing was building into this kind of ethnographic anthropological field of surveying people and cultures. And as I said before, you know, the travel writers here, they do see the railway stations in particular and railway carriages as the perfect place to see a wide range of the British public. And they make comments, they make ethnographic kind of comments about these people. They're really interested in surveying them and understanding why and how they behave the way they do. So this is a really another interesting part of that kind of reversal that the travel narratives provide. So Malabari, again, our favourite critic of the British, writes, the British crowd in a railway carriage or other public conveyances, as a rule, orderly and well behaved. The presence of women makes it more so. This remark hardly applies to a crowd of holidaymakers abroad. I think this is probably still fairly relevant, I guess. You know, I think about traveling on the train, and you know, people are generally reading a book or listening to music or a podcast or whatever. You know, you tend to get quite quiet railway carriages, or at least that I've experienced. And I suppose certainly in this kind of new normal that we have. And it just makes me smile, this kind of final remark, this kind of foreshadowing of perhaps that stereotype of Brits abroad, not quite as orderly and well behaved. And Doss, going back to Doss, he writes, I've travelled in all classes of railway carriages, and I was struck with the unsocialness, if I may call it so, of the English railway traveller. Sitting side by side with others and confined to the narrow space of the railway compartment, they seldom speak to each other. They may travel over scores of miles together, but they remain mute. They seldom speak to each other unless they be acquaintances. He then goes on to talk about how reading is a really major part of the British railway travelling practice. I do not find fault with the reading, but I think all reading and no talking in a railway carriage is too much of a good thing for the time and the place. So here Doss is making a judgment on British railway travelling practices. He is observing what they're doing. He's saying, okay, yes, I can see what they're doing, but actually I don't agree with it, and I think it's not right. He is making that judgment as previous travel writers will have made on many cultures around the world. On entering a carriage, you form a correct idea of the reservedness of the English people. You see your fellow passengers sitting quite mute and like statues. Again, this idea of the solemnity and the unsocialness of the British travelling public really comes up again and again. It's very very prevalent in the travel writing, which I think speaks to how interested they are in this travelling public, but also how fundamentally different it is from what they're used to. So here Mukherjee writes, here passengers do not shout to each other as they do in India, at railway stations or at public places, and even at home they talk in whispers, or at any rate in a low voice. Our habit of talking loud frequently drew upon us the eyes of our neighbours, and though they did not say anything, we soon found that it was better not to attract attention. Now this moment, I think, is it's a really important moment to signal out. So throughout the travel narratives, some, not all, do make reference to moments of racial prejudice and aggression that the Indian travel writers experience in Britain. On the whole, this is generally experienced when they're in contact with lower classes, with working classes of Britons. That's what they say. But you do also get moments that what we would now kind of consider microaggressions enacted by kind of middle and upper classes. And I think that's what we've got here. So we seem to have a very kind of passive aggressive, I'm imagining, British railway passengers maybe in the station, kind of really giving a bit of a side eye and glaring at Mukherjee and his fellow travellers because they're talking too loud, and it's drawing attention to them, and it's not appropriate for the British railway station. So their Indian habit, they find to be soon that it was better not to attract attention. I think there is a clear sense of cultural aggression there. When the work people go to and from their work, my Indian friends would perhaps do well to avoid travelling third class during these hours, as they are likely to find themselves at times jostled somewhat roughly by the horny-handed sons of toil with whom they will have to travel. So again, that's kind of referencing those the perceptions of the lower class British public that these Indian travel writers have. Now, of course, bearing in mind that these men are very elite men, they're very wealthy, very well-to-do men in India. They of course bring certain class prejudices with them, but also they're very aware of the racial aggressions that they will receive, certainly from this demographic, and they warn any other travelers that are coming to Britain, don't try not to travel at this time with these people in this class, because chances are you will be harassed in some form or another. And finally, to kind of finish on ideas of the London Underground. So again, this was an even more of a novelty, obviously in the late 19th century, and it does really split opinions with the Indian travel writers. So we have again a kind of return to this excitement and wonder that the cousins in the 1840s had seen with the first railways. We have this exoticism and magicalness of the Underground Railway. So Anel Doss, the most wonderful of the English railways is the Underground Railway in London, called the Metropolitan Railway. This railway is no doubt a great and wonderful feat of engineering, and they had to surmount endless difficulties in constructing it. It is said to have cost £1 million sterling. Again, it kind of returns to those early ideas of engineering and technological superiority as that mark of British superiority, British civilization. So it's interesting that we've kind of had those two phases, the first of overground railways and now underground railways, furthering that superiority. It is, however, the Metropolitan and District Railways of London that are really triumphs of John Bull's energy and perseverance in the means of locomotion employed in his metropolis. They are lighted by gas, blah, blah, blah. The railway carries about 90 million of passengers during the year and is one of the safest, easiest and cheapest modes of locomotion in this hive of human beings. So again, the railway is very much affiliated with a kind of British national character, that John Bull energy, and again marking that kind of that mark of superiority. Nothing is wanting to make London the most wonderful city in the world. The Underground Railway system is a wonder in itself. The Underground Railway is a great triumph in the art of engineering and is one of the greatest wonders the world can show. It excites our admiration. It speaks of the power and strength of the human intellect. It tells us how man can conquer the stupendous difficulties by his ingenious scientific contrivances. It gives us a hint of what perfection, science, and art could reach. It unravels the secret of the greatness of the English nation and explains that her greatness lies in her science and arts. So again, this very, very clear affiliation with what has made the English great is the railway, whether that's overground or underground. It is the marker, supposedly, of English, British, imperial, modern superiority. Yes, so Pillai, again in London and Paris through Indian Spectacles, again says, it kind of describes the sensation of going in and out of light and darkness. And he just, in this, it's quite a long passage, I won't read it well, but he's describing being on the circle line and not realizing that it goes round and round in a circle, and is getting a bit confused at why it's not getting to one end or the other, but actually, oh, it's the circle lined, it's going round and round. How strange and yet how instructive. There is much of the city above London as there is underneath it. London has been able to double in size, apparently, because of what the Underground Railway has given it. And back to Malabari, our infamous critic. We've had all this awe and wonder at the Underground Railway, and Malabari is having absolutely none of it. He writes, "Of all modes of railway travelling, the Underground seems to me the least desirable. I have had 1,000-odd trips by railway while in England, but do not remember having tried the Underground more than half a dozen times. I cannot bear the dark, damp, smoke-laden tunnels. Englishmen see no harm in it, and in order to prove their sincerity, they travel underground by the million every day." Malabari is very clear that he sees the Underground Railway dark, damp, smoke-laden. He sees it. How is this civilized? How is this progressive? How is this how is this really better than the kind of traveling that he might have in India? He's saying that the Englishmen, in order to prove their sincerity, feel that they have to travel by it underground by the million every day, but actually, do they really enjoy it? How can anyone enjoy being in such terrible conditions? And this is the kind of condition that British imperial railway modernity has produced in the eyes of Malabari. So those are all on my quotes today. Sorry, there was quite a lot there. Thank you all for sticking around, and I'm sorry I lost my voice there for a bit. But I would be really interested to hear your thoughts, to hear any recommendations for further research you have, any ideas and any comments are very welcome. Thank you very much.